Okay, welcome to the ARMS Advent, well, rather the Get to Know Your ARMS Advent video. In this video, we're going to look at how easy it is to have this system running very quickly, and also going to look at a little bit more detail on how it works. Then we will explore how to set up a convoy. Following that, we'll look at tracking players and following them. Look at some debugging tips, some caveats, and then some future plans that I have for this system and where I plan to take this. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is how simple it is to have the Advent either follow a player or another grid. So we're just going to hop in, toggle the follow player mode on. Now we'll toggle the system on. You'll see the rotation of the camera. That's part of the calibration process. When we jump out, the camera is now aiming at us. As you can see, wherever we go, the camera goes. That is the tracking camera. And now if we scoot back, do a hard juke, go behind it, it should back up and then realign. So even if you get behind this thing, it's going to follow you and then come back and stop. Okay, so now let's go back in, toggle the system off. Now we're going to put a lead vehicle in, just another ARMS Advent. Now we'll get back in, switch the mode, this time instead of follow player to follow small grid, toggle the system on. You can see the camera is now locked on there to this grid. Get in, release the park, and head off. Same mechanics for the most part. We'll get into a little bit more of the details, but further in the video. But the follow mechanics work pretty much the same when you're following a grid versus following a player, and that's how easy it is to switch. Okay, so now what we're going to look at is more of how this system works on a surface level, so you can have the knowledge on how to operate it properly and eventually debug, which we'll go over toward the end of the video. So the first thing you need to understand is the purpose of this camera. This camera is part of the newer AI block DLC set, so yeah, you'll have to get all this stuff on the rover. That's just the way it is. Anyway, so the camera sits on a rotor, and the rotor is attached to a turret controller, which allows you to track players that are friendly as well as grids that are friendly. And that's the following system. But what happens is this is a subgrid compared to the rover. This camera system is a subgrid, and these cameras here these sensors, there's 6 of them in number. They are responsible for directing the rover, and so if it needs to go front, needs to go backwards, to the right, to the left, all of that is determined by that camera and those sensors. There are no AI blocks used in this at all. It's primarily or really just timer blocks, sensors, and a rotor. And that is pretty much all you need to know as far as how the directional system works, at least for now. So what we'll do is we'll just hop into the cockpit and take a look at some of these hotkeys and explain what they mean. So the first one is the on and off toggle for the entire system. So when it powers off, which it is now, you can kind of look inside of there and see that the sensors are red, and there's a red timer block as well. And when you power it on, you're going to get the spinning calibration startup cycle, which we saw earlier, and it's currently set to follow vehicles. So once the camera gets calibrated, it will then go and face the vehicle ahead, and will probably take off as well, because I think we're a decent distance away. So there it goes. Okay, now it did not. I guess we're within following range. So um, that's how you turn the system on and off. When you turn it off, it does not get recalibrated in the sense of spinning. So there's no indication other than the lights going off again that it's turned on off. The number 4 key is set to increase the maximum speed. So you can see those numbers go up from 154 to 172. These are increments of 18, I believe. And you can bring it down with number 5. And that's good for when you want to, well, it can be helpful depending on the type of configuration of your convoy you're setting up. Like how many vehicles do you have? Are you just following the player? So it can, we'll get into why speed is important later, but just know that that's there. Keys number 6 and 7 have to do with the system's minimum distance sensor. So basically this sensor says that if a player is within this range, then stop, because we're close enough to our target. It actually has nothing to do with the camera. Camera's just set to aim, and this sensor that 6 and 7 are on determines how close the rover will approach something before it stops. Okay, and depending on the direction that the sensor's facing, that value is different. But right now, the back of it, which actually correlates towards the back of the vehicle, is set to 2 meters. And that is useful for when you have convoys, because if another vehicle were to be parked right up against it here in the back, it's kind of an odd angle right there. But if there were another vehicle right here, and that minimum sensor detected that vehicle, it wouldn't move and follow the thing in front of it, whatever's in front of it. And so when you switch, you're going to want to change that to the appropriate value, and we'll look at that in an example. And when you're following the player, you want to expand that so that, well, it just works better. And we'll see that as well when we do a little bit more demoing. So that's what 6 and 7 are for. Number 8 and number 9 are just your modes. Number 8 is follow player mode. Number 9 is follow grid mode. And remember, make sure the system is turned off. That's your 1 key. We're going to hit it. It's on. We're going to turn it off again. And now you feel free to switch as much as you want from 8 or 9. And so that's a quick rundown on the dashboard commands. Something else you're going to want to make sure that you do before you change any mode or prepare for it to follow in any ways, you want to make sure the parking is engaged. So you can see there it's engaged now. So if you don't do that, you're going to have a bad time, and maybe we'll try to replicate some of those issues during the debug section of the video. One other helpful thing to know is that this does have these thrusters that you see constantly going. They are outside of the damage range, so that's nice. And what they do is they provide constant traction towards the ground by having an override on. And right now, that's just always on. The future model will probably have a toggle on and off, which will help conserve energy. You can add your own with an event controller if you want to do it based on speed or whatever, or power usage. So that's up to you. The other aspect of traction control is when you turn, the vehicle will lean in the direction that you're turning. So if you go left, you see that it leans, and when you release, it leans back up. And same thing to the right. You do it to the right, comes back up. I have noticed that it is finicky sometimes, but I'm not exactly sure why, but it's not a real big deal because I don't think this adds a whole lot to the traction, but it may do a little, or maybe I'm not going down far enough. But whether you're piloting this rover or whether the system is, this leaning mechanism will be active, so you don't have to worry about those. And those sensors are there towards the rear near the tires, and so they just sense that the tires are coming close enough in their range. Another important feature to understand is that the camera loses visibility towards the rear because of this turret. You can see it tracks me when I come back on this side. It loses visibility there once I go behind the turret, and it comes back and follows. Okay, so the reason that is, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this off. The reason that is if you have a vehicle behind, you don't want this camera looking at that vehicle, because it's just going to end up aiming towards it. The camera is going to switch aim towards it and cause this rover to follow it, and it's going to be following it, and then you're going to have a problem. So the turret is there, which you could use anything really. It's just kind of a double practicality to use the turret here. You can use that to block the visibility of the rear, and I think this width that it takes up is pretty optimal. That way, when the rover turns, it doesn't expose its rear vehicle to it. You know, you don't want one block back here blocking. You want 3 or 4, so or 3 or 5. So keep that in mind. If you decide to alter this or place anything else back there, you're going to want to make sure that rear is blocked if you intend to use it for convoying. If it's just for the player, that's okay, because this thing can follow a player that's behind it. There's no problem with that. Alright, so let us get into what most of you are probably here for, and that is the convoy system, or how to use this system to lead a convoy. First thing you need to understand is that there are limitations that you have to respect, and these are either limitations of the system that I just haven't had time to make more intricate, which will be more intricate in version 2, or it's due to limitation that is caused by the nature of the game, and so that's that. But convoys are quite possible, but they do have their limitations. So here we just have a regular rover spawned in, and I do recommend, as you begin to experience this mod, to go into creative and do all of this. I really wouldn't recommend trying to figure everything out in survival, because you're going to want to do a lot of copying and pasting just to kind of get the feel for how things work. So we have this grid here copied now. I want to go ahead and configure it so that the next rover that I paste inherits the same values, which doesn't seem like we need to change much. The only thing we want to maybe change is the sensor value for the rear facing brake, because like I said earlier, if the grid that is following this vehicle gets close to it, then it will not continue forward, because it senses that another grid is within a certain parameter. And so this sensor for the keys number 6 and 7 are at the front of the vehicle, and it's only extended 2 meters back towards the cockpit from the front. So no grids behind us are going to intervene with that. So it looks to me like we can go. I recommend 0 to 7 meters or so. So let's copy this grid. We're going to paste it a little far out, and that way we can see the system get activated. So it's not really that close. We're going to get in. We're going to hit number 9, which is our follow mode, and we're going to hit number 1 to power it on, and it continues, gets close, and it stops. All right. So the main thing that we're going to want to consider here is it's 2 things we need to consider. How many vehicles are in this convoy? And depending on that, we're going to need to adjust the speeds of the vehicles. So here's the general rule of thumb. The more vehicles, the more speed restrictions you need. This is because of rubber banding. We'll see that later. It's just, like I said, a limitation of the way it is. And so we'll just start off with 1 vehicle. So this one is a copy of the one in front. All that's different is that it's following the grid in front of it now. I want to go in and look at the wheels, which if you'll remember, our speed hotkeys are on number 4 and 5 at the bottom down there. We can increase speed with 4, decrease it with 5. When you have 1 grid following you, it's a pretty good idea to take the grid right behind you, which is the one that we're sitting in right now, the first following vehicle. Um, and you want to put its speed limit, I would say 5 to 8 kilometers an hour faster than the one in front of it. And this rule is going to apply each time you go backwards. And so if you have another vehicle, so this one's going to be set to, we'll just do 105. All right, so 105. So the one in front can reach a maximum speed of 100 kilometers an hour, and this one can reach a maximum speed limit of 105, and that's going to allow it to catch up if it gets behind. Okay, so that's necessary, because if it gets behind you, you either have to slow down or it has to speed up, and if it can't go faster than you, then it can't catch up unless you slow down. And we don't want to be slowing down. We want to keep going, right? So let's just see how well this works with one vehicle. I'm gonna leave the HUD on so you can see that this, well, we'll just turn on the antenna. All right, well, that's not working for some reason. Anyway, we're going to use this green reticle to kind of gauge how far it is away throughout the process. So we're just flooring it right now, wide open. We are going pretty slow just for the sake of this test. This speed right here that we're going at is a speed that you would probably want to use if you had a really huge convoy. And huge, in my estimation, for this particular system is about 5 or more vehicles. I haven't even tested past that, so I don't even know what happens, but I have tested with a 5, and it's best to keep it slow like this. We'll look at that later and I'll explain why that is, but for now we can see that the system's working. You saw how I stopped and it stopped. All right, and if I turn pretty hard, you know, it has no problem keeping up, especially at the slower you're going, the better the system's going to work. But this is probably about as slow as anybody could mentally tolerate. So even if you do have a large convoy, it's still pretty slow. But at this speed, we can kind of get an idea for what happens. So keep an eye on the distance there. You can see it's about 40 meters now. It was 50. That's because I dropped off. But as we leave, what's going to happen is it's going to keep up until it reaches a certain speed and distance, and at that point it will coast. You can see it kind of backing off there, and if it gets too far after coasting, it will re-engage the drive to follow. And if I begin to brake a little bit too fast for it, it will also brake a little bit. It's really just reversing the propulsion. It's like a pre-brake system you could think of. The coast system is the first boundary, where it's approaching the vehicle, so it kind of just lets off the gas like you would if you were driving without cruise control. And once it gets a little bit too close, it will then reverse the propulsion, not so much as to stop, but just to kind of slow it down. Then once it reaches a particular point, it will actually stop. So you can kind of see that effect there. But that whole coast and pre-brake system does not kick into effect unless you're going 20 kilometers an hour or more, and that can be adjusted, but that's more of a fine-tuning thing. I wouldn't mess with that if I were you. So let's bump it up now and just see what these two rovers are capable of by themselves, because we're not going to want to go this slow if it's just two of us. So let's say 200 kilometers an hour for the one we're in, and we'll put this one at 210. I think this translates to roughly 100 miles an hour, which in real life is pretty daggum fast. All right. And also, something I did forget to mention is that at a certain range, only 20% power will be supplied to propulsion, but after that, it's 100%. So anyway, we can see here it's keeping up quite fine. We are able to go faster. Really, no problems there. I mean, if I were to really spin her around without flipping, no problem. If we go over the hill, the sight is lost, but it does recover. There is a 15-second window where if you go behind a hill, or visual connection is lost between you and that camera, because grids and voxels can both cause that. It's got 15 seconds. It will continue in the last seen direction. So if you go over a hill and it loses connection for some reason, it's still going to go that way for 15 seconds, and after that it will stop. You can change that value too, a bit more fine tuning, but I think 15 seconds is appropriate. And it's beneficial for that to happen, because if you have a rover go rogue, eventually it's going to stop instead of just perpetually going until it hits its demise. So the main problem with high speeds, which we're at a pretty decent speed for this system to handle, the main problem is the braking system being able to catch it in time. So if you were going 100 miles an hour behind someone and they slammed on the brakes like this, you know, that's hard to match. And so this system is working off sensors that I don't know how often they update, but it takes a second for this thing to really, you know, match your brake. See, there we got hit. Luckily the wheels are the only things that hit, so we didn't get any damage. So that's a negative benefit. You want to treat the things that are following you with a little bit of respect. All right, you want to keep it slow for them as you're braking, is what I mean. So don't be rude. Don't brake check them. Just let him catch up. Remember, he goes from 20 to 100 propulsion power. That's why it takes a second, but that's needed for slower movements as well, because everything's not always fast. So when you do brake, just kind of, you know, be a gentleman about it. You know, don't be a jerk. And especially if you're using a lot larger convoy at a high speed, you definitely want to be mindful of how you're braking. All right, so let's go ahead and just copy this, and we're going to get some more grids in here. We're going to paste them a little bit far out. That way we know the system's getting activated properly. It should, even if we do it close, but still, it's nice to know that it engages. I've had so many issues building this thing. I'm just paranoid like that. But what we're going to do now is remember our rule for speed limits. This has to be 5 miles an hour faster than the one in front of it. And actually, I think we have it at 10 mile an hour intervals, because we're going a lot faster than we were earlier in the first little session. So the other one is 210, and we're going to bring this one up to 220. All right, and we're going to copy this one, and we're going to paste a little bit far out. We're going to do the same exact thing. See, the system got engaged. And we'll go here to our wheels and increase the speed limit to 230. You may be wondering why I'm not doing the 4 and 5 key. It's because the increments are too drastic, in my opinion, for this system. So they go in 18 integer intervals, but we need 5 or 10. So we're good there. We got a nice little lineup. And we are going to save, that way if something happens we'll come back and get this weather adjusted too. And clear weather, get this thing saved. Alright, so now let us go and see. So we have 3 followers here. The one behind us is 74 meters, so it's not yet within the 50 meters. If it doesn't get back in the 50 meters within 15 seconds, the system stops, and that also applies to the ones behind. So we want everybody to catch up, and we kind of get this equilibrium that you can sense, and you'll have to play with this and, you know, figure out how to not lead too fast or too slow. All right, so think of it just like the bedroom. You know, you gotta hit it just right. So here we can see that one in the back is falling behind, and it doesn't have too much longer, probably about 7 more seconds. So we're going to ease off just a little bit. We're not going to stop, which that kind of did happen. So you can see here, the larger the convoys are, the more of an issue you have. So this is why a high-speed convoy is not that practical, at least for a beginner. And I'm the only person experienced in this system, and I even struggle sometimes. So you can see the risk of brake issues back there. So You can do this. That other guy's going to come in hot. See, you can do this, but you really need to practice it. So what we're going to do now is just, well, I could slow it down for you, but you saw how nice and smooth it was earlier. For a convoy this size, I did not park, which is the first rule. For a convoy this size, I would say keep it under 200 for sure. Maybe between 120 and 180 might work. But anything 4 or 5 larger, you really want to slow it down. And I've been in military convoys before, and they go slow for that very reason, because the rubber banding effect can cause people aren't going to slam into each other because they're human beings, but it does cause the rubber banding effect the longer a group of things are or is. So that's the state of the game. Maybe at the end here, I'll just throw in a little fun video with let's say 20 vehicles, and just see if we can manage that at a low speed. So we'll see at the end. Okay, let's do a tutorial real fast on player following specifically. So when you're in this and you want to follow a player, you want to make sure that the hotkeys number 6 and 7, the sensor that they represent, you want to make sure that value is around 20 as it is now. If you're in convoy mode, you want to have it roughly at 7, 5 to 7, but it could be all the way down to 0, but I'd recommend 7. But for following players, you want it at 20, and that's just because this is the distance behind the vehicle that it will detect objects and brake. And so if the vehicle were to back up right now, it would stop backing up at 20 meters because it detected that I was here. But if we were in convoy mode and it was at 20 meters and a vehicle was parked right here behind it, it would think it needed to stay braked or in brake mode. We're going to get back in here and put the value where it needs to go, which is at 20. And we're going to switch it into player follow mode, which is number 8, turn it on with number 1. And so once we reach 20 meters back, he'll kick in, and he'll turn and try to adjust. And I also have the speed pretty far down because we're in player follow mode, and that's important as well. You don't want this thing going 200 kilometers an hour following you. It's just going to be a lot of stopping and starting. So I have it set at 8 right now, which is a little bit slower than the max run speed, but you can put it at whatever you feel comfortable. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is to player following. As I mentioned, this camera tracking is not going to work back here, but it will inherit the last known direction. And so if the camera did see me over here, these wheels would be turned the opposite direction, but it's really not even a problem because you come back here and it readjusts and eventually locates you. So all is good there, and that is the bare basics of how to follow players. I will say that it will not follow players that are in a seat or a cockpit. Probably not in a seat. I know it won't follow them in a cockpit because I've tried that. So don't expect to set up convoys based on player presence in cockpits or seats. Alright, so now we will talk about how to debug issues with this. I do not have any, I'm not able to replicate any bugs because the ones that do exist, I don't quite understand them yet. But there is a pretty straightforward way to handle pretty much any bug. There's a few things you can do. So there is nothing wrong with this vehicle right now, but we will act as if it was. So as we have this camera follow us, if you were to encounter an issue where no matter how far back you went, the vehicle would not move, maybe the wheels would turn and the camera would track properly as it is now, but no matter how far you go back, it wouldn't follow you. Something you can do is a manual recalibration. You can just walk around it and have that camera loop through all of those sensors. That usually fixes a lot of propulsion and steering inversion issues, which don't really exist anymore, but that's been helpful in the past. Another way is to do the same thing, but with this button. You just turn the system off and on again, and then it will recalibrate. I have noticed that often the camera may not face the player, especially if you switch from one follow mode to another without calibration, but sometimes the camera won't aim at the target that you want it to, whether it's a grid or a player. But what you can do is you can go in front of it and then it will pick you back up. So that's one thing you can do. You may experience other issues. Just make sure to look at your speed and make sure you're not asking it to go really fast or way too slow, depending on what you want. Sometimes that can happen. Make sure that your number 6 and 7 values are appropriate, whether that be, again, if you're in convoy mode, you want those at about 7, and if you're in player follow mode, you want it at about 20. And that fixes a lot of stop issues in convoys, making sure that value is true. That's pretty much the only issues I think people are going to have, but I guess we'll see. You guys just let me know as you find them. Another problem you may face is that as you leave the rover, it doesn't move, and you tried the earlier debug steps, such as recalibration. One thing that's indicative of this problem is when you approach, it just keeps going. And then it eventually stops, and the same thing happens the further you go out. Nothing happens. You come in and it just kind of goes and it stops. That is because you forgot to put the park brake on, and now it looks like it's broke because it was already broken, and so it's kind of inverted right now. So again, you've put the park brake off. I would say just turn it off, park, turn it back on, and should be good to go, I think. Nope. Maybe that's because the park's, well, let's do a manual recalibration. Let's follow our steps here. This is good, and I tried to mess it up and I have, so. Okay, so it's not going. So if we release the park, remember it was inverted earlier, so it may still be. So let's just back away from it, let it kind of do its thing. Let it catch up. All right, now I think it's going to work properly because it's in player follow mode. Yeah. So what we did there is we had a inverted parking. The user forgot to park the vehicle properly, and so we had to go in there and make sure that happened and corrected the inversion of the parking. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about future plans for this system. This is version 1, and I do intend on releasing a version 2, which will take the things I've learned from this, and I think I'll be able to make a better system that can not only operate at longer ranges than this one, but also incorporate large grids, because right now, as you can see, we're limited by the range of the sensors on this, and so there's not a whole lot of room for very large grids if you want to move at a speed that's reasonable. So I have some problems to overcome with that, since we're trying to aim at not using mods or scripts, just pure vanilla copy and paste out of the workshop type stuff. So that is the next planned steps. Right now you can't really transfer this system to another vehicle, although you could. You just have to know how to configure that. There's a lot involved doing that. So I guess after I get the second version developed that is compatible with larger rovers, I'm hoping I can make it modularized to where you don't have to get a vehicle from the workshop, but you can just get the heart of the system and paste that into your grid. But there's going to be challenges with that, making sure that all the trigger values that these timer blocks have and the sensors, all that stuff works and transfers properly when building in survival. Otherwise, it's going to be way too complicated to work with. And if it's finicky and you strive during survival to create one of these and then it blows up because the system sucks, well, that's not going to be good either. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at now for the future, and I guess we'll just see what happens. Guys, let me know what you think. I want to see your videos. I want to see all your complaints and your praises. Help me know what I can do to make this system better and what you would like to see in the next system. Thanks for watching.